Good afternoon, everybody. I believe you all can hear me. Thank you so much for being on with us today. And especially a huge thank you to Dr. Toscano. We can't wait to get into it. So I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, John Knox Village. I am your moderator, Teddy Tinney, the production and events manager at John Knox Village. Welcome and thank you for joining us. The killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis this past May sparked outrage and pain throughout our country, being the most recent on a long list of Black Americans who were wrongfully killed in this country, including Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. George Floyd's death has now initiated a renewed conversation in this country about systematic racism and the divide that has existed since the days of slavery. We felt it was important to start having our own conversations at John Knox Village, and in June, we held our first race relations discussion, Understanding and Closing the Divide, a discussion about race relations in America. We begin our series by hosting a panel discussion with Sheriff Gregory Toney, behavior specialist Marsha Wilson, and educator Akeem Sadino to help us understand what's needed to create a culture of empathy, understanding, and respect. Today's presentation is our second discussion in this series. In order to move forward as individuals and as a society, we need to really understand where it all began. So today's discussion will focus on educating or refreshing us about our American history with the intent to further deepen our capacity for empathy. We are joined here today by the extremely knowledgeable Dr. Vincent L. Toscano. Dr. Toscano is a retired professor of history from Marist College in Poughkeepsie. Excuse me, I'm not a New York native, so forgive me.
Poughkeepsie.
Poughkeepsie. Thank you so much, Dr. Toscano. This is in New York, Poughkeepsie. During his 30 plus years there, he also served as an assistant vice president for academic affairs. At present, he lives in Davie, Florida, and lectures for both the Nova Southeastern University and Florida International Universities in their lifelong learning programs. Dr. Toscano will lead us through our very own history and address the origins of racism, the consequences, contemporary issues, and how it affects our lives today. We will then have a brief question and answer period in which you can alert us of your intent to ask a question via the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Welcome, Dr. Toscano, and please take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Teddy and I had a little bit of difficulty, so he's going to be my switch changer. As I talk to you, I couldn't figure out how to get my thing to work properly. The topic is racism in America. Subtitle, All Lives Matter, but in America, non-white lives haven't mattered so much. I thought before we talked about it, it would be helpful to have a brief look at what racism is. It's a doctrine that groups people together on the basis of physical appearance only, color of their skin, texture of their hair, shape of their eyes, or any other features. And what it does is it divides people based on the superiority of one group over another. So racism is really an ideology of discrimination. And we will be taking a look at that. One of my favorite quotes about the past is from William Faulkner. The past is never dead. In fact, it isn't even the past. And as we will see, that's very true of racism, which is very much alive after 325 years in the United States. To understand it, we have to look at that past. And what we have to look at very closely is the institution of racial slavery in America. And that's an important point. Not every Black person in America was a slave, but only Black people in America could be slaves. Next slide, Teddy. One of the best books I've ever read about this is by Winthrop Jordan called White Over Black. It won a book prize. It won a number of prizes when it was published way back in the late 60s. It's over 700 pages long. And so Jordan was convinced by a number of people that he really needed to streamline it so that students could read it because they didn't have the patience to wade through 700 pages. So the book that I would recommend to you if you're interested in this particular subject is by Jordan as well. It's called The White Man's Burden, which I think is a very interesting title. Racism is the white man's burden. Next slide, Jay. According to him, as he looked at the attitudes of Englishmen in terms of their early visits to Africa, There were a set of ideas that they had, which they introduced into England and therefore into English colonial culture in the New World. And there were three themes that were very powerful. One was skin color. They used the word black. That's a loaded word in our language. We know, of course, that Africans are not all black. The skin color they use are range widely, but the Englishmen used a single term, black, to describe Africans. And in the English language, in the English dictionaries, if you take a look at the definitions and synonyms of blackness, you see things like evil, sinister, and diabolical. So it's a word that's hidden, has a lot of connotations, and it's very interesting that that was the word that was used to describe visitors to Africa in terms of a single color. The second issue was the fact that these folks were not Christian, so therefore they were heathens. Anyone who was not Christian was a heathen, and they had defective religion, although in fact not only did they have their own versions of religion, but in many cases Islam was very powerful in parts of Africa. But this is the 16th and 17th century, and in Europe, in Western Europe, you're going through the Reformation, and you have all kinds of issues about religion and religious ideas. So for the Englishmen, the second thing by which they set themselves apart from Africans, in addition to skin color, was the fact that they were not Christian. And finally, and perhaps the most significant of all over time, is that these folks that they came into contact with, they characterized as animalistic. They were brutish. They were sexually endowed. You find references to their propagators. They mate with gorillas. And most of all, they want white women because white women are desirable. So those were three themes that are reflected in the writings of early English visitors to Africa. They brought them back to England, and they made their way to the New World via those people. Next slide, Terry. Next slide, sorry. And so there you have the history of European culture. One of the most powerful comparisons is the comparison of humans to apes and monkeys. On the right is a picture of a science book that was used widely in the 17th century. And on the left, you can see from a contemporary point of view how that image was used to denigrate President Barack Obama, clearly indicating that as a black man, he really is a monkey rather than a human being. Next, please. Next slide. On the top left, there's a recruiting poster from World War I, and you could take a look at it. What it really suggests is that the Germans were animalistic. They were killers. And of course, in their arms is a white woman whom they're going to savage. And that theme has been throughout our history, this idea of the libidinous, sexually rapacious black man. In the middle is a book that was a bestseller in the 19th century, no, 20th century, early 20th century, by Don Tracy, The Man, the Girl, the Payoff. And on the right, you see a picture of that payoff. Not too frequently or not too unfrequently. We don't know for sure, but we know that somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 Black Americans were lynched in the years after the Civil War until the 1930s. More recently, in 2015, a white man attended church service in Charleston, South Carolina, and then he opened fire on the parish and he killed 9 people. He was quoted as saying, "I have to do it." And there it's repeated the same themes that you heard going back to the 16th century. You rape our women, you're taking over our country, and you have to go. And so those themes that the English visitors, early visitors, 16th century visitors delineated remain very powerful in America even today. Next slide, please. When we take a look at slavery in North America and what would become the United States of America, and we compare it to slavery elsewhere in the Americas, we find some important differences. Perhaps the most important is the fact that there was in Latin and South America a countervailing power, and that power was the church. And it was the position of the church that all people have souls, and therefore they are people. And so when freedom was encouraged, and once they were freed, they looked upon the Negro as a free man. They had souls, they were people. In North America, the slave was never a person. Slave was chattel property without a moral personality or legal status or even recognition as a human being. That's one of the major differences between slavery in America and slavery in the Central and South America. That's not to say that slavery wasn't brutal all over, but these attitudes go a long way to helping us understand the difference between these two, these societies. Next slide, please. Another book by another historian makes the point, Elkins makes the point that in America, slavery was a system of total control. When you were a slave, you had absolutely no control over your own destiny, or the destiny of your children, or the destiny of your spouse. They could be bought and sold, and you had no say in it. And so it was impersonal and rigid. And one of the most controversial parts of his book is when he talks about the impact of slavery on Black persona, on Black behavior, on Black psychology. And he says, when you compare the slave psychology to the psychology of people who were in concentration camps, they exhibited very often very similar kinds of characteristics: infantile, docility, passive acceptance. A lot of people don't buy that little black Sambo image, but it was a provocative book by Elkins. And of course, he repeats the notion that in America, slavery was a place where Black people lost their personality, they lost their personhood, lost control over their lives. And of course, they passed along this status to their children. You were a slave if you were born of slaves. It was a hereditary position. And it was very difficult to escape it. Next slide, please. When the United States finally became an independent country, they had to decide about American citizenship. And this is the Naturalization Act of 1790. Who could qualify to become an American citizen? And of course, they use the word alien to describe anybody who's not an American citizen. But you see at the top of the list, what you have to be is a white person, a free white person. If you're not a free white person, you are unable to be considered to be an American citizen. All those other things, of course, go along with that. But the first, number one, is the most important. A free white person. Next slide, please. And so these ideas continued throughout the 18th and into the 19th century in America. Jefferson Davis, who was a war hero in the Mexican War, he was a senator. He personally was opposed to secession, but when his state, South Carolina, seceded, he went along with them and wound up, of course, being the president of the Confederate States of America. And this is what he had to say just before he left the Congress to take that new position. African slavery is a moral, social, and political blessing. And earlier than Davis was the decision in 1857 by the United States Supreme Court, when Dred Scott sued for freedom because his owner had taken him to free territory. The Supreme Court unanimously agreed with this decision written by the Chief Justice Roger Taney. Blacks have been regarded as beings of an inferior order, altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And so Dred Scott would remain a slave. Those are some of the lingering notions, and this, of course, is 200 years after the first English contacts with Africans. Next slide, please. And so what you had is a growing divide in the United States between states where slavery was permitted and slavery was not. In 1860, the only national institution remaining, the churches had split, the colleges had split, the Democratic Party split when 10 southern states walked out. They were opposed to the nomination of Stephen Douglas. And as a result, because he stood for a position which said people should, and the states should decide whether they want to be slave or not. And the Southerners didn't like that. So the Republican Party, which was brand new, had only been formed in the 1850s, they won the election, and Abraham Lincoln was elected. And when he was in his first speech, he said, "I will not interfere with slavery where it exists." In fact, some people don't know that one of the original versions of the 13th Amendment was a guarantee of slavery where it existed. That's how far Lincoln was willing to go in order to prevent war. But the southern states did not want to accept the results of the election. And of course, I say this in the recent context, which scares me a lot. And so they decided to leave, secede, create their own government. And the Confederate States of America was born, and it was dedicated to two things: white supremacy and the preservation of slavery. That decision initiated a war which lasted almost 4 years, killed over 750,000 Americans, and left ruins in the South and animosities which continue even to today. Next one, please. Next slide. When the Civil War was over, there were attempts on the part of the Union to provide some support and some protection for the former slaves, and they were now called freedmen. But eventually, in 1877, Union soldiers were removed from all of the former Confederate states, and the southern state governments wasted no time in creating a whole set of laws. We call them the Jim Crow laws, which outlined the legal basis for segregation. And in 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation. And their decision, which I'm sharing with you, is very interesting. The underlying fallacy is the assumption that enforced separation stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction on it. So it's all in your minds, guys. It's all in your minds. The fact that you're being discriminated against and being segregated is not a problem except in your own head. And then it goes on to say, legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instinct and to abolish distinction based on physical difference. If you try to do that, you'll only accentuate the difficulties. And here's the key. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the United States Constitution cannot put them on the same plane. And so this is the beginning of America's era of apartheid. Jim Crow becomes the legal basis of Southern society and politics. There are no legal remedies available to blacks in order to challenge the laws that force them to ride in the back of the bus or to sleep in separate places or drink from different fountains. America's apartheid was as rigid as the apartheid you found in South Africa. Next, please. Joshua, next. So there we were. After the Civil War, we had an America that was divided on the basis of race, for sure. You had theaters for colored people, white and black drinking fountains, imperial, we wash for white people only. And Paul Laurence Dunbar, a black writer, wrote this poem, which I think captures the hurt, the anguish all black people had as a result of the fact that the government and the law would not protect them against all of this. We wear the mask that grins and lies, hides our cheeks, shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. Trying to make sure you understand that we're only pretending. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. We wear the mask and we smile. Let the world dream otherwise, because we wear the mask. We're not going to show you how anguished and angry and frustrated and tortured we are. We're going to wear the mask and we're going to pretend that everything is okay. Next slide, please. There were other contexts in which America's racism reflected itself, not just in terms of blacks, but other peoples. Next slide. There were, of course, the original inhabitants of North America, the Native Americans. And there were a series of wars between Americans and the natives that began in the 17th century and didn't end until the closing of the frontier in 1890. So for almost 300 years, the American government and American people made war on the indigenous people. And for the most part, their way of life was almost completely destroyed. The Congress passed the Indians Appropriation Act. The Indian reservation system was created. And of course, we know what life is like on those reservations, how poorly those people live, but they had to stay on those reservations. And they couldn't leave the reservation without permission. And if they did, and they were found by the Army, they could legally be shot. Native Americans were not citizens of the United States until 1924. That's how long it took for them to be admitted to citizenship in the United States. Next slide. Then, of course, in the 19th century, we had a whole wave of people who emigrated from China because of the lack of opportunity in China. So they came here to seek a fortune, to get a job, send money back to their families. And of course, the California Supreme Court characterize them as a race of people who are inferior, incapable of progress, and differing in language and physical conformation. Between us and them, nature has placed an impassable difference. And the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, said, they're ignorant of our Constitution, they're impossible of assimilation, dangerous to our peace and welfare. And so in 1882, the United States closed the door to Asian immigrants, to immigrants from China. Up until that point, we had no restrictions whatsoever on who could come to the United States. If you could get here, you got here. Beginning in 1882, Chinese were excluded. They were not allowed anymore. And you can see in that handbill the attitude of a lot of people. The last line, hip, hip, hooray, the white man is on top. Next slide, please. The Japanese avoided having that restriction legalized because of the gentleman's agreement, where the Empire of Japan would not allow Japanese to emigrate to the United States. And you could see some evidence of the attitudes of Americans toward Japanese. No Japs in our schools, Japs keep moving. It's a white man's world. It's a white man's country. And so both Asian and Japanese and Chinese people, as well as black people, were subjected to very vicious kinds of racist exclusion. Next slide. And then you had this wave at the beginning of the 20th century of 15 million people arriving to the United States. And most of these immigrants were, well, I root for them because my ancestors were among them. They were from the non-English speaking parts of Europe. And you could see that cartoon, The Danger to American Ideas, the riffraff of immigration. They're the riffraff, they're criminals, they're rapists. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Next slide. This book, The Passing of the Great Race, was a bestseller in 1917, 1918, and 1919. And condensed in there is the characterization of the people that we call the new immigrants coming to this world after 1900. The weak, the broken, the mentally crippled, the lower stratum, hordes of wretched submerged populations. They fill our jails, our insane asylums, and the almshouses. The whole tone of American life has been lowered and vulgarized by them. And so in the 1920s and 1930s, racism was very, very strong in the United States, even through the 1940s and 50s. Next slide, please. As a result of all of this hullabaloo, Congress passed the National Origins Act of 1924, immigration restriction. It was a quota system, and it was set up to ensure that the American population would look like it looked in 1890 before these damn immigrants started to come over. And as a result of that, there were lots of exclusions, lots of people who were not allowed in. Next slide, please. So while all of this was going on, of course, Black people were struggling with the consequences of Jim Crow, discrimination, KKK violence, inability to vote, inability to go to school, get a decent education. And so as a result of that, one of the most significant public movements took place in the early 20th century. Next one. Between 1916 and 70, 6 million people moved out of the South to the urban Northwest, to the Midwest, and to the West. If you're interested in that, that's a wonderful book by Isabella Wilkerson. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns. And she talks about American leaders, including the Obamas, who can trace, Michelle Obama, who can trace their roots back to people who were among those who picked up and marched their way out of the South into the North in order to find better work, better opportunity. They also found that although racism wasn't embedded in the law as it had been in the South, it existed just as powerfully. And people in the North were not willing to accept blacks on any equal basis. Next slide, please. So what you had beginning in the early 1919, 1920, 21 were a series of race riots. The most powerful one was in Chicago. It lasted almost a month. People were killed, homes were destroyed. And as a result of that, you can see that's a picture of people going through the neighborhoods of Chicago, white guys looking for black people that they could hang. Next slide, please. This is one that got a lot of attention when President Trump's group decided to hold a rally in Tulsa. Most people until that time had never really heard of the Tulsa Massacre, but it was a massacre nonetheless. There was a district in Tulsa called the Greenwood District, and it was a place where African Americans lived, black people lived. And they were very prosperous. They were doctors, lawyers, dentists, barbers, shop owners. And their success, their economic success, provoked a lot of animosity among the other folks who lived in Tulsa and surrounding counties because they were not doing as well. And so one incident sparked a revolt. And at the next thing you know, there is this riot. And they were given weapons by the city. They attacked black residences. They destroyed 35 square blocks, 800 people admitted to the hospital. They placed 6,000 black people interned in large facilities and held them for about a week. Many, and a lot of this never appeared in the press. It wasn't until 2001 that the state of Oklahoma began to take a look at its own history. And when they did, a state commission examined all of these events and gave the estimates to about 300 people dead. But the whole neighborhood called Greenwood was destroyed. People were dispersed all over. Next slide, please. And so what you see in these headlines is that in the 1920s and early 1930s, there were race riots in Arkansas, in Alabama, in Douglas County, East St. Louis, Illinois. And so it seemed that as the black folks moved north, they faced all kinds of resistance and became targets for white reactions, saw them as interlopers. Next slide, please. Here in Florida, the most famous was the Rosewood Massacre. And not only were the people massacred, but the town itself was burned to the ground. None of the homes owned by black people existed after this rioting took place in 1923. All of the black people living in that town called Rosewood were driven from the town, and to make sure they never came back, all of their possessions, including their homes and personal possessions, were burned. Next. And so in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, if you wanted to be successful as a black entertainer, you had to be a comedian. The most famous, of course, would be Lincoln Perry, Step and Fetch It. Then there was Rochester with Jack Benny. And then, of course, Amos and Andy. In the original radio show, Amos and Andy, they were played by two white guys. But when the show became syndicated on television, they had to find black guys to play them. As one historian has said, people see comedy as something that's merely funny. But when you take a look at black comedy, there's a wrong layer of social commentary about race relations in the United States. And you could see that with continuing today with Richard Pryor and other comedians who continue to talk about this and to remind America that there's a lot more to do. Next slide, please. Then in 1954, the Supreme Court reversed that decision, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, declaring that discrimination was not acceptable. And the key to that was not just a legal argument, but an argument based on sociology and psychological evidence conducted by Mamie and Kenneth Clark. They had there these two dolls, a dark doll and a white doll, and they would give those dolls to children, and they would ask all kinds of questions. Which is the black doll? Which is the white doll? Which is the pretty doll? Which is the beautiful ugly doll? Which is the smart doll? Which is the stupid doll? And they found that when they did this, particularly in the South, the students, black people, the black kids would identify all of the positive characteristics with the white doll and all of the negative characteristics with the black doll. And it was very clear that it was generating among students a feeling of inferiority. Clark tells the story. He said, you know, when I would do this and then I would ask this question of the student, I'd say, well, which is the doll that's like you? Black students in the North, one of them would run out of the house screaming. They couldn't stand that because they had just said the black doll was ugly and stupid, and now that's me. He said, but in the South, one little boy looked at him and started to laugh and said, well, he's a nigger, I'm a nigger, so that's that. And that was the evidence that Thurgood Marshall used in that famous case involving Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, in which the ruling was that segregation and public education is no longer acceptable. Next slide, please. And so what we have seen is that for more than 300 years, the various institutions in America defined Africans and their descendants as inferior. And this is an important point because when such ideas are afforded the legitimacy of the law, the legitimacy of the pulpit, legitimacy of the college, for such an extended period of time, they become part of the normal elements of a culture. This is the way it is. This is the way it should be. It doesn't make any sense to think about it differently. This is the way we are taught. And it's a very, very difficult thing to kind of challenge those ideas because they are deeply, deeply entrenched in all of our institutions. And you could see the power of these ideas even after all the years of civil rights agitation. Contemporary America has enduring forms of institutionalized racism in our systems: criminal justice, education, housing, economics, politics. It also seems clear that racism continues to affect individual and group behavior, like those folks on the bottom that march at Charlottesville, or those people parading against the civil rights protesters, waving Confederate flags and Nazi flags. Next. And so now we talk about where we are today. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, talks about incarceration. Blacks represent 12% of the adult population, but a third of all the people who are sentenced in the United States. Whites account for 64% of adults, but 30% of prisoners. That line that I underlined, there are more African Americans under the control of the criminal justice system today than were enslaved in 1850. And so what she really has shed light on in a lot of this, and again, it's a book, if you're interested, you might want to read, is that we have created a caste system in which people are locked into an inferior position by law and custom. Many people like to think it was overcome, but it's not. It hasn't been. As she says in her conclusion, we have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Most of the people in our prisons today are people of color. Next slide, please. Take a look at the number of people who die by police shootings, by race. And what we find, of course, is that the rate of fatal police shootings among Black Americans is much higher than for any other group in the years between 2017 and 2020. And of course, we are dealing with the fallout of that almost every 2 weeks as we see another story of another Black person being shot by police. And so this trend has been around for a long, long time. And it continues to be at the heart of a lot of the agitation in America today. Next, please. Next slide. Then in terms of segregation, we think the schools are supposed to have been integrated, and yet we find that 75% of white kids go to schools that are mostly white. And African American students, they attend schools that are mostly Black and Latino. In the year 2017-18, graduation rate was 92% for Asian and Pacific Island students, 89 for whites, 81 for Hispanic, and 79% for Blacks, which means that 21%, maybe more, of Blacks are not getting a high school education, which means that they're not going to be able to find jobs, which means the only possible avenue of success for them or financial opportunity would be in things that are somewhat illegal. Next, please. And in terms of residents, we still see there is a great deal of separation between African Americans, Latinos, and white people. Typical neighborhood for white people looks like that on the top line, overwhelmingly white. For African Americans, mixed. For Latinos, even less mixed. And so this is a consequence of a practice that we call redlining. It was a practice by which banks denied mortgages, mostly to people of color, in urban areas so that they could not buy a home in a certain neighborhood. Kind of sounds like the pledge of the president to keep the suburbs free. And it took place all over the place and backed by the United States government. It no longer has that backing, but it is still practiced, I am sure, throughout the United States, where some people are shown some houses and others are shown other neighborhoods. Next slide, please. When we talk about bias and hate crimes, we can see that the one factor that generates the most hate crimes, beatings, attacks, killings, is race and ethnicity. And so over 7,000 people suffered from this. And this is from police data. It's probably higher than it is on that seat, but clearly race is the #1 factor in terms of hate crimes. Next slide, please. And we take a look at this slide, it shows a picture that we know is true, which has become even starker with this pandemic, that there is rampant inequality in America, and that equality is in many ways a reflective of somebody's race and ethnicity. If you take a look at the median income for white versus Black and Hispanic, you can see that the gap is significant, absolutely significant. And so consequently, this is the result of the fact that many of these folks, Black and brown people, work in low-paying industries. They are, of course, essential workers. They collect the garbage, they drive the trucks, they clear away the snow, but they don't make a lot of money because they do not have the college education necessary to get white-collar jobs. Next slide, please. And so that's the end of the story. This is what we look like today. We are still struggling with an inheritance that is over 300 years old, and I'm hoping that perhaps we find a way to overcome it in the years to come. I'll accept any questions or comments that anybody has. Thank you very much for your attention and for not booing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toscano. And actually, if you could go to the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and show your video so that we could see you and connect to you more, that would be,
What am I doing?
there we go. I
All right.
will spotlight
Oh,
to you right
oh,
now so
okay.
that our listeners can connect with you.
All right.
And
I had this on to make so I could hear better and you could hear me better. Go ahead.
perfect. That's not a problem. And so if any residents or any of our listeners have any questions that they'd like to ask, at the bottom of your screen, you're able to go to the chat box and you can go ahead and put in that you'd like to ask a question.
I'm looking forward to them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let me see here.
Teddy's in charge. So. Looks like Susan's trying to say something.
Susan, okay, Susan, let me unmute you right now.
Can't hear.
1 second.
Any luck?
Give me one moment.
Can you hit unmute on your computer? No?
Okay, how about now?
Oh, yes. Very good. Nice to hear you.
Thank you so much. That was very informative,
I'm glad.
and it made
Depressing. Depressing. Right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've heard it before. I mean, I didn't hear anything that I didn't know. The only thing I didn't know or didn't think about was the difference between the Catholic Church and the whatever the English were.
Well, there was no established church in the English colonies. There were a variety of churches, but not one. Whereas in Latin America, the established church was the Catholic Church, and so it had a lot of institutional power.
Yeah, but what I wanted to, the thing that I realized, and I was slow in realizing it, I guess, other people must have realized it much younger than me, is how the female slaves were treated by the masters and taken advantage of and raped and the other aspect was the breeding of slaves that we did, treating them like cattle and making them breed.
Yes, they were chattel, they were property like dogs, cats, and horses.
So that's so horrific. I just can't. Ooh.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You got another one here.
Got a hand up. Go ahead. Question, comment.
Yes, question. How much or how do you recognize or how much of racism is unconscious or subconscious, and how do you recognize it and how do you counter it?
Good question. Good question.
Very good question.
I always start my lecture this way, but I didn't do it today. But when I do it, I say this. If you were born and raised in the United States of America, you have been infected with racism. There's no escaping it.
Yeah.
It may not be overt, it may not be visible, but in terms of attitudes, in terms of little gestures, sometimes the jokes you laugh at, sometimes the images that come to mind, sometimes when you cross the street to avoid a certain person, we have all been infected with this. And so a lot of it is not really, we're not really aware of it. It takes a lot of effort on our part to become self-aware.
Yeah.
Okay, next.
Thank you. I have a question from Diane and John Dulcimer. Given the current state of awareness by more people, do you have any optimism about change?
No.
Oh, God.
Can you expound?
Sure. We're talking about the weight of 300 years, and it's going to take at least a century or more of concerted effort on the part of the government, on the part of the religious institutions, on the part of the educational institutions, on the part of the family itself, in order to begin to adjust and to shape new ways of thinking They're very powerful. And of course, it's going to get worse because the demographic data is showing us that America is no longer going to be a white country in 30 years. And so it means the loss of privilege and status and power for people who are white, which frightens them, which will exacerbate the attitudes that we're talking about right now. So that's why I'm not as hopeful as I'd like to be.
Thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? I have one from Diane Barton. Did some blacks have black slaves?
Yes.
Can
Yes.
you expound on that?
There were people in the South, black people in the South, who won their freedom, and they were skilled laborers, perhaps blacksmiths, and they were part of that culture. So they bought labor for themselves. They had slaves. They owned slaves. It was the way they lived. It's hard to explain this. I mean, because we hear a lot about, let's take down George Washington's monument and Thomas Jefferson's monument. But you've got to allow for the times in which these folks lived. The time element was very different than it is today. And so it didn't occur to people not to have slaves if you could have them.
I have one more question from Susan. Susan, if you could unmute
Yes.
there.
You mentioned the thing about blacks owning slaves. That was not an unusual situation in Africa.
No.
That within their own original culture, slave owning was quite common.
Well, it was mostly the result of the war between various tribes. And
Yes.
so when they fought the tribes, the losers, they would wind up losing their wives, their children to the victors. And don't forget, it was the Africans who captured the slaves and sold them to the Europeans in order to be taken to the New World.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yes.
Right here in John Knox Village, there have been times when I've been, for example, on a cart, in one of the carts, those little golf carts that take you around. And this driver is black. Or most of the drivers are black.
No surprise.
Or Latino. And the other passenger is rude and talks down to them in a way that makes my skin crawl.
Not
and
unusual.
I sit there with my fists clenched and I don't say anything. Should I be saying something?
That's up to you. Depends. If you're bigger and stronger than the person who's talking, probably you should.
I can be bigger. I can blow myself up bigger.
All right.
No, but I mean, am I belittling the driver by speaking up for his position when he is unable to speak up for himself?
I don't think you're belittling him. I think you belittle him when you keep silent.
Okay, that's what I want to know. Yeah. That's what George tells me too.
That's what Dr. King told us. In the face of all of this, silence is cooperation. All the people in Germany who were silent as the Nazis came and took away everybody. No protest. So
way our whole family.
Thank you, Susan. I'm gonna go to the next question from Yael, one of our staff members here. Dr. Toscano, do you feel there are any laws that can be passed to make changes to the current state and ongoing problem of police unfairly killing blacks?
I think that the whole criminal justice system is in need of reform. I think that being a police person in the United States is a terribly difficult job. I think that we ask too much of them. I think if we could focus, as some people have argued, and when they use that term defund the police, what they mean is make the police focus on criminality and leave domestic disputes and all that other stuff to other people. Don't make them the catch-all for all of the social problems in a community. So it's a very, very difficult job. I don't know what can be done except to say to the policeman, we appreciate your efforts and we want you to focus on criminals, and we want you to be retrained in terms of how you use force. In that example of shooting a guy in the back, I don't know, was that justified? I can't find any reason for it to be justified. If they were afraid he was trying to run away, just shoot the tires in the car. There are a lot of other options. And so it seems to me comes too easily to people in power to use their weapons against people whom they do not consider to be worthy. Does that help?
Thank you, Doctor. I have a question from Alfredo, who has his hand raised. I'm going to. Can you
hear me? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Hello. What are we going to do about it? So, what about the idea of reparations? Why aren't we talking about, we owe these people, our fellow Americans, reparations for the evil that we've done. Now, the problem with reparations is the details. Who deserves it, who doesn't.
I personally think
one of the solutions to this.
I think personally, I think.
With my idea?
I'm sorry.
I want to continue. Just 1 second.
Go ahead.
The idea of a universal basic income would solve the problem, because almost all the money for the universal basic income would help the lowest strata of our society, which are the brown and the black people in America. So that's a suggestion. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that we need to invest a lot more in making opportunities available to people who have been cut out of them. Education, employment, training, all of those things. And to me, that makes the most sense rather than money payment. Guaranteed basic income, I don't know. Who gets it? Who does? What's the cutoff? It become all kinds of problems. I would rather see us use the resources of this country to make college affordable, maybe even public college free, improve the quality of our secondary education. My granddaughter goes to school in Broward County here in Florida. She's at home right now. They're gonna push them all back into the schools under pressure, and I'm not sure that the air conditioning systems there are very safe. And we know that coronavirus spreads through the air. We need to invest a lot of money in our infrastructure, schools, hotels, and then all the other things. And if we did that, that would create a lot of employment rather than give people money. I think people would rather earn money by doing something that they take pride in. That was my feeling. Them is my feelings.
Thank you, Doctor. A question for me. I would like to, or could you speak more to the disparity between the financial disparity between when I guess the slave owners, how that wealth then compounded, and then from freed slaves or slaves that ran away, what that disparity was like and how that still affects us today?
I'm not sure I quite get what you're asking me, Teddy.
Sure. So at least from my understanding, there is a large amount of wealth that's compounded from slave owners or companies that were built off of the money or the work from having slaves, and how that then was compounded over time, and how maybe that disparity has then affected where we are now when we speak on the wealth disparity between blacks and whites.
Well, I mean, a lot of the wealth in the South was created by slave labor. All right. And then when the Civil War was over and slavery no longer existed, you had a whole system of tenant farming. And so you had people of lower classes working hard for very little reward and contributing to the accumulation of wealth by other people. And that hasn't changed. The same thing was true with a lot of the immigrant groups when they first came, digging ditches, working in the tunnels, building the bridges. They created the wealth in the country, but the wealth was controlled by the top 20%. And today it's probably even less than that in terms of racial and wealth disparity. The gap between, well, 8% of the Americans own almost all of the stocks and bonds in America. 8% own almost all of the stocks and bonds in America. So when you watch those stock and bond prices go up and down, they're enriching a very small group of people, very small group of people.
Understood. Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions while we have Doctor? I see Frank Showman. Yes, yes, indeed. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Where is he?
I got it. Okay, sorry, I pushed the wrong thing.
That's okay.
You know, this is something my wife and I talk about quite a bit. And there's been a kind of semi-movement here in John Knox. So, you know, what do? We have scholarships available for people who work here. We have other kinds of things. These are good things. These are absolutely good things. But Alfredo, one thing that could be, I don't know if it could be, to have essentially a cabinet position whose job it is to recognize not just people of color, but people who are struggling at young ages, a kind of general national educational scholarship, not just little ones here and there where all the colleges are doing it, but a national when there's a group of people, however you designate them, however you decide who they are, the chances are a lot of them are going to be of color, who are trying to advance, to have some public agency say, okay, here is what we can do to help you advance. We'll give you guidance. We'll give you a guidance counselor. We'll help you find this thing and that thing, and make it a public job to make the country better. You know, and here, even here, you know, I have friends who want to talk about coming over. He says, I'm not going to live in a plantation. You know, they come visit, they see it looks like a plantation. Yeah. And yet it's a wonderful place. But this other thing, you know, this bigger picture, Alfredo, might be, you know, it might be, and I know he hears me, I'm just pointing out Alfredo, but he's pointing out a very important thing. What's the kind of thing that can be done? You know, oh, woe is me. We don't want to do, I don't want to live on a plantation is, my wife is wait a minute. Nikki, say what you want to say.
Hello there. My name is Nicole, and I'm the one that represents everything you guys are talking about. It's a heavy load to carry.
I'm sure it is.
I try most days to carry. Bottom line is, I have difficulty the way we are quite happy paying those people that we like so much, such little money, and we don't seem to mind. My friend will say, oh, I have this wonderful lady and she cleans my house and I only pay her $10 an hour. We all are capable of it, and all of you folks there, I haven't seen anyone who would go out of their way to pay somebody what they're worth. And that means that we are all maintaining this sadness.
Absolutely.
And I wish somebody would talk about that. Why don't we pay them well so they get out of the lower class?
And I brought it up, you know, I brought it up at the meeting of the health committee meeting. Hey, these people who work at Woodlands are doing tremendous amount of work, much more than usual for somebody just taking care. And they get paid a little more than most, but why not pay them a lot more?
I don't know. Have you all watched, you've been watching the pandemic, right?
Yeah, the answer.
And you have seen the faces of the people providing the majority of the health care, right? The faces of those people are dark. People cleaning the rooms, bringing the water, taking care, except for the specialist doctors, the rest of those people have dark skins. And they get paid a quarter.
I wanted to finish my statement.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump on you.
No.
Go ahead, Frank.
The answer is that you know, oh, it'll increase the rates. It'll cost us more here.
It
If
will.
you pay them that much more. And so what? So what? So it'll be another $1,000 a year to pay everybody at the Woodlands 10%, 20% more than was the going rate. Look at what they're doing. And I don't get an answer. You know, we don't want to raise the rates to some ridiculous amount or much higher. That's all.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for those statements, and thank you, Nicole. What we'll do is things that specifically are in regards to John Knox, we'll be taking note of those so that we can bring that up specifically to our department.
Excuse me, Teddy. I see a bunch of hands waving here.
Sure. I see Diane,
Bob?
John.
Susan, Bob, John, Bob, that Bob Collier.
Actually, let's go to Bob because we haven't heard from Bob.
I'm gonna unmute.
Holding it up, the host. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
I guess one of the questions I have is, do you think, and I hate to get political at this point, but I'm afraid I'm going to, do you think that Trump tonight will fan more racism by blaming the riots on Black Lives Matter?
Undoubtedly.
It's interesting that the person that shot 2 people just last night apparently was somebody who was in favor of Blue Lives Matter, which
And he was allowed to walk down the street carrying his gun openly, and the police didn't stop him.
even after he did the shooting.
Well, before.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So is there some answer that we can give to or response to this?
What do I look like? The Wizard of Oz? I have no idea. I have no idea.
Okay.
My job is to simply tell people what the past has been, the weight of the past that presses on us, and the fact that we have to struggle very, very hard in order to stop ourselves from becoming complicit in what we recognize is an undesirable system.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Bob. We're going to go over to the Dulcimers.
Unmute.
We discussed reparations in Philadelphia 40 years ago, and people said, we didn't hurt them. Why should we pay? A lot of people did not feel that they were white and benefited from being white.
I agree. I would be opposed to reparations if it meant direct payments to people, because I think reparations means investing in those people and giving them the opportunity to have the future that everybody wants. That's what I think. But who am I? I don't know. Anybody else? Susan? Susan?
Go ahead and unmute.
Let him talk, Susan. Let him talk.
You'll have to unmute them for them to be able to unmute.
There we go. Hello. Okay. One thought comes to mind, which is that a lot of this ideas about how to improve things are top down. You know, give scholarships to Black people or open up more university positions and so forth, but it doesn't change the facts on the ground. A Black person may have a PhD and applying for a job, and his white competitor may have just a bachelor's degree. If the hiring person has, you know, a bias, that doesn't really, it's not really going to change things. He's still going to hire the white person instead of the Black person. And so you have to start by a lot of education, starting from primary education, I guess.
Oh, sure.
Right the way through, you know. And one thing that's where I didn't grow up in the United States, but when I came here, I lived in the North in New York City. When I came down here, I had this somewhat notion of, you know, what the Southern thing was going to be like. And I was surprised and pleased when I was walking in our town and kids were coming out of high school and black kids and white kids were walking together holding hands.
What year was this?
Well, it's about 20 years ago, 15 years ago.
In Vero Beach.
In Vero Beach, which is pretty conservative and pretty white bread.
I remember the
So-
first time I came to Florida was 1962, and the thing that shocked me was a bathroom with two fountains, black and white. I had never seen that coming from Jersey.
Yeah. So
We had Italian and Irish, but not black and white.
yeah. Well, that was just as bad. But yeah, but the idea to me is that the new generation, when they start to become accustomed and meet and interact with kids of their own age but of different races, they're much more accepting of
Yes, I believe so.
than their parents.
I
And
believe so.
hopefully that will start a national.
It's going to take time.
Yeah,
It's gonna take time.
It's going to take 100 years is probably optimistic.
Yeah.
I
Somebody
think
has one hand.
That's Nicole.
actually, I believe that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank
Oh, thank you all.
So much. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Toscano. We are absolutely grateful for your wisdom and your navigation.
I have no wisdom. I just have my notes. It was good to see everybody.
Okay, let me. Miss Nicole has one more. I'm gonna let Miss Nicole have one more question, and then
Go ahead.
This is to everyone about education and teachers. My grandson, he's now 25 years old. Tall, very, very tall, very black and very handsome. And when I went into school, and a nice little school, we got him into what was a nice school. And I said, how is my grandson doing? This very blonde teacher. Oh, she said, Steady does this. Steady knock this kid blade. Steady does this. So I stood there. I never snapped her. I was so charming. I said, what does he do good? Oh, he's the leader in the class. All the kids follow him around. That's why the education system doesn't work. Because this kid that was bright, capable, informed, so the other kids follow him around. But the teacher didn't see him as an intelligent human being. I don't know how you get over that, but that's the problem. So.
Problem is we're human. My granddaughter is the product of my daughter's marriage to a man from Nepal. So you can imagine that combination. Neapolitan, Sicilian, and Nepalese. Okay, it was nice to see you all. Thank you very much, Teddy. Appreciate
you all
all your
so
help.
much. And I'm going to thank our audience. Thank you for everybody who participated. I'm going to implore you all to continue to do way more research than what we have here, because this has just been 1 hour. And we cannot possibly delve into all of the intricacies of our history and how it affects people that we have here today. So please do your own research. John Knox will be providing a resource list that should be up within the week. So please check JKV Connect.
If you can afford just one book, I would recommend The White Man's Burden. It's small, it's readable, it's available through thrift books for $2.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Please look for our next presentation that will be coming up. Thank you, Dr. Toscano.
Thank you.
You guys have a great and lovely day.
You too.
Thank you.